Tonight we have a long journey ahead. The words are a soft murmur in the quiet dark, an invitation into a world of dust and myth. Our path does not begin with glory but with exhaustion. Hercules sits on a sun-baked stone outside the sanctuary of Delphi, his great head bowed. The divine madness that had gripped him has passed, leaving behind a hollowed-out silence, a soul scoured clean by an unspeakable storm. The scent of laurel and burnt incense hangs in the still air, but it cannot mask the deeper odor of spent rage and profound weariness that clings to his skin. The Pythia's decree echoes in the vault of his skull, a sentence etched not in wax or stone, but in the very marrow of his bones. 10 labors, a penance that stretches to the horizon of the known world and beyond. He does not feel like a hero in this moment. He feels like a man upon whom a mountain has been placed, its crushing weight a constant, terrible companion. His hands, capable of uprooting trees, lie limp on his knees, the knuckles scarred and swollen. A simple wooden club, its surface worn smooth by a grip of necessity, leans against the stone beside him. It is an extension of his arm, a tool of survival, yet in this quiet, it seems just another burden to carry. He rises. The movement is not the explosive surge of legend, but a slow, deliberate uncoiling, each muscle protesting the return to purpose. He lifts the club, feeling its familiar heft, and slings a worn water skin over one shoulder. No fanfare marks his departure. There is only the crunch of his sandals on the gravel path, the sigh of the midday wind through the cypress trees, and the immense, waiting silence of the land. The road unfolds before him, a pale ribbon of dust winding through the hills of Phasis. It is an ancient track worn by countless feet, herders, merchants, soldiers, pilgrims. Now it bears the imprint of his. The sun, a white coin in a bleached sky, beats down, drawing the smell of hot earth, dry time, and sun-bleached rock from the landscape. The light has a tangible quality, a heavy, golden haze that makes distant objects shimmer and swim. Insects drone in the scrub. A hawk circles high overhead on a thermal, a silent speck of intent. He walks. The rhythm of his stride becomes the first beat of the long story. With each step, the sanctuary shrinks behind him, and the vastness of the Peloponnese opens ahead. His mind, still tender from the recent tempest, does not race ahead to monsters or trials. It rests on the immediacy of the journey, the grit between his sandal and foot, the pull of the strap on his shoulder, the expanding ache in his calves as the road begins a gentle, inexorable climb. Hours melt into the heat. The hills roll like great, slumbering beasts, their flanks covered in silver-green olive groves and dark patches of pine. He passes a solitary shepherd who nods, eyes wide with recognition and a touch of fear, then looks quickly away. Hercules does not meet his gaze. He is already becoming something separate from the world of men, a figure set upon a singular, lonely path. As evening approaches, the light softens, painting the world in tones of ochre and lavender. He reaches a high ridge and pauses, leaning on his club. Before him, the land falls away into shadowed valleys, rising again to distant, blue-hazed mountains. They are the mountains of the Peloponnese, a jagged silhouette against the fading western sky. Somewhere in those brooding, mist-wreathed ranges lies Nemea and the first of his impossible tasks. They seem infinitely far, a world away. The distance is not just one of leagues, but of spirit. He drinks sparingly from his water skin, the tepid water a minor sacrament. The first star pricks through the deepening blue. The night will be cool. The journey truly has begun. It is a journey of miles, of muscles and will, but more so, it is a journey into the weight of atonement. He turns his face towards the darkening mountains, and with a breath that is part sigh, part resolve, he steps forward again, his figure blending into the twilight, a solitary giant carrying the first whispers of his epic burden into the gathering night. The mountains that had been a hazy promise on the horizon now rose around Hercules, ancient and silent. The dusty tracks of the lowlands had given way to a narrow path that wound upward into the embrace of ancient oaks. This was the Nemean region, a place where the air itself felt different, thick with the scent of sun-warmed stone, dry thyme, and the sharp, clean perfume of pine resin. Light did not blaze here as it had on the open road. It filtered down through a high canopy in shafts of dusty gold, illuminating floating motes of pollen and dust in silent, swirling galaxies. Hercules moved with a new caution, his footfalls deliberate and soft on the carpet of fallen leaves and dry needles. The profound silence was not empty. It was a palpable presence, broken only by the distant, liquid notes of a hidden bird and the low hum of insects. It was the silence of watchfulness, of a land holding its breath. His club, held loosely in one hand, seemed an almost crude intrusion in this verdant, sun-dappled temple. He was a guest here, and an unwelcome one, and every sense he possessed told him so. The forest floor was a tapestry of light and shadow. Ferns unfurled in damp hollows, and moss clung to the north sides of gnarled trunks in emerald velvet. He noted the subtle signs of the woods, a deer trail faintly pressed into the soft earth, the scratch marks of a wild boar on a tree, the discarded shell of a tortoise. But as he penetrated deeper, the older, gentler signs began to fade. The bird calls grew fewer. The insect hum diminished. The very quality of the silence changed, deepening from peace into something taut and expectant. The path curved around a great outcrop of lichen-crusted rock, and the forest opened abruptly into a small, sunlit clearing. Here was the first evidence. A low stone wall, painstakingly built, now lay in a scattered tumble of rubble. Beyond it stood the skeleton of a farmstead. The roof of the simple dwelling had caved in, not from weather or age, but from a single, catastrophic blow. Splintered timbers splayed outward like broken ribs. A clay storage jar lay shattered near a cold hearth, its contents, dried beans or grain long since scattered and taken by birds and mice. There was no gore, no grim spectacle of carnage. That was the unsettling heart of it. The destruction was absolute yet clean. It spoke of a power so overwhelming that life had been erased in a moment, leaving behind only this eerie, absolute stillness. A wooden plow lay snapped in two. A child's carved toy, a simple horse, rested in the dust near the threshold, untouched. Hercules stood amidst the ruins, his eyes tracing the story written in the wreckage. This was not the work of bandits or war. This was the work of a force of nature, a predator of such singular purpose that it left no messy signature, only void. A faint, musky odor lingered at the edges of the clearing, unfamiliar and primal, cutting through the scents of pine and earth. It was the smell of a creature that knew no rival. Hercules' grip tightened on his club. This was the lion's calling card, a testament written not in blood but in absence. The farmstead was a statement. This domain was claimed. He moved on, leaving the clearing to its silence. The forest seemed to close in behind him, the golden light taking on a more somber, bronze tone as the afternoon began to wane. The terrain grew rougher, the oaks older and more widely spaced, their branches forming a vast, cathedral-like vault overhead. He was entering the heart of its territory now. The watchful feeling intensified, a prickling at the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the dappled shade. He was being observed. The birds had gone utterly silent. Even the insects had ceased their humming. The only sound was the soft crush of his own footsteps and the low rush of his breath. Ahead, the path led into a broad, rocky basin where the sunlight pooled more strongly, illuminating a flat expanse of sun-bleached grass and wildflowers. At its far edge, the dark mouth of a cave was just visible, shrouded by a curtain of hanging ivy. This was the place. The air was warm and still, heavy with the scent of crushed oregano and hot stone. Hercules paused at the tree line, his massive frame half hidden in the shadows. He let his gaze sweep the sunlit basin, every sense stretched taut. He saw nothing move. He heard no growl, but the presence was now undeniable, a vast, patient and predatory awareness focused on him from the hidden places. The forest of Nemea was no longer just a landscape. It had become the lair, and he had stepped across its threshold. The dappled light seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first move in the silent, age-old dialogue between hunter and hunted. The silence in the sunlit basin was a living thing, a taut wire strung between the shadowed trees and the cave's dark mouth. Hercules remained motionless, his breath a slow, controlled rhythm that seemed the only sound in the world. His eyes, accustomed to the dappled gloom, scanned the open space. He noted the patterns in the grass, the way the stems lay flattened in wide, sweeping arcs near the cave entrance, the resting places of a colossal form. The musky scent was stronger here, warm and animal, woven into the very air. He did not charge. His labor was not one of blind fury, but of grim necessity. He stepped from the tree line into the full glare of the afternoon sun, a sudden and stark intrusion into the stillness. The light felt hot on his shoulders. For a long moment, nothing happened. The forest watched. Then, from the depths of the ivy-shrouded cave, came a sound, a low, rumbling exhalation that was less a growl than a vibration in the earth, a note of profound annoyance that stirred the dust at Hercules' feet. A shadow detached itself from the greater darkness of the cave. It moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, emerging into the light not with a roar, but in a silence that was more menacing than any noise. The Nemean Lion filled the space before its den. It was larger than any lion of the mortal plains, its pelt not tawny but a strange, metallic gold, shimmering in the sun as if dusted with powdered bronze. Its eyes were chips of cool amber, regarding the man in its clearing with a detached, almost regal curiosity. This was no mindless beast. It was an apex sovereign, its very form a testament to invulnerability. Hercules felt the weight of his club, suddenly understanding its futility. The stories were true. No weapon of man could pierce that hide. The realization settled in his gut. cold and clear. The confrontation would be decided not by strength alone, but by the application of it by a terrible intimacy. The lion paced, a slow, deliberate circle that began to narrow the distance between them. Its muscles rolled beneath the gleaming pelt like separate creatures coiled beneath a shield. Hercules matched its movement, turning to keep facing it, his own body lowering into a crouch. The world shrank to the basin, the two figures, and the singing silence. The attack, when it came, was a blur of gold and sudden explosive sound. It was not a pounce but a surge, a wave of muscle and momentum that crossed the space between them with shocking speed. Hercules did not meet it head-on. He shifted, a sidestep born of instinct honed in 100 brawls, and the lion's bulk brushed past him, the wake of its passage buffeting him with a hot, carnivorous wind. A massive paw, tipped with claws like curved daggers, swept out in a backhanded blow that Hercules barely avoided, the air whistling where it passed. They circled again, the lion's breath now audible, a hot, rhythmic huffing. Hercules' mind worked with a desperate, crystalline clarity. He saw the power, the speed, the impervious defense. His eyes tracked the creature's movements, the way its shoulders bunched before a lunge, the slight dip of its head. The next charge was more direct. This time Hercules did not fully evade. He turned his body, taking the glancing impact on his shoulder, the force of it staggering him, a searing pain blooming where the claws scraped, failing to pierce deep but scoring the skin. In that moment of jarring contact, his left arm snaked around the lion's neck from the side. What followed was a brief, brutal, and silent struggle. There was no epic clash, only a desperate, close-quarters contest of leverage and breath. The lion thrashed, a whirlwind of contained fury, its roars now muffled against the hero's chest. Hercules locked his arms, his face pressed into the metallic fur that smelled of sun and iron, his entire world reduced to the strain in his back and arms, the heat of the beast, the frantic pounding of a heart not his own. He held on, muscles corded and trembling as the golden body bucked and twisted. The sound was a raw, grinding struggle, the scrape of claw on bronze-hard skin, the choked, furious rasps. Then, with a final, convulsive shudder, the great form went limp. Silence flooded back, deeper and more profound than before. Hercules released his hold, staggering back, his chest heaving. The lion lay at his feet, a fallen monarch. The sun beat down on the scene, indifferent. The labor was over, but the task was not. He knelt beside the beast. The impossibility of skinning it with any blade he possessed was absolute. Then he remembered the stories, the whispered solution. Taking one massive forepaw, he pried a single claw from its sheath, a curved, yellowed thing as long as his hand and sharp as a surgeon's tool. It was the only thing that could match the pelt it had once protected. The skinning was a methodical, quiet task. It required not strength but a patient, gruesome precision. The claw parted the legendary hide where no spear or sword could, whispering through the golden fur and the tough dermis beneath. There was no ceremony to it, only the slow, careful work of separation, the soft tearing sounds, the growing pile of what was once invincible. The sun began its descent, casting long, melancholy shadows across the basin. By the time he was done, his hands and arms were stained, and the magnificent pelt lay spread upon the grass, empty and vast. He cleaned the claw and sheathed it at his belt, a grisly trophy of practicality. Then he lifted the pelt. It was heavier than he expected, a dense, supple weight that seemed to drink the light. He swung it over his shoulders, the lion's head becoming a hood that settled over his own. The sensation was immediate and strange. The interior was cool, the fur soft against his neck. The weight was not just physical, it was the weight of a finished thing, of a burden both lifted and assumed. This hide, which had turned every weapon, was now his armor. It was also the first tangible symbol of his penance, a second skin of proof. As he turned to leave the basin, the forest seemed different. The watchful tension had bled away, leaving only the peaceful stillness of evening. The bird song, tentative at first, resumed from the deep trees. The golden light had softened to a gentle, rosy hue. He walked back through the oaks, a figure now transformed, clad in the essence of his first labor. The pelt swayed with his stride, a constant, heavy reminder. He did not look back at the cave or the clearing. He had entered the forest as a man seeking a monster. He left it as something else, a hero marked by a skin of gold, carrying the silent, weighty proof of his journey's brutal beginning into the gathering twilight. The golden pelt of Nemea felt alien in the damp. Where it had been a shield against the sun and weapons, here in the approaches to Lerna it became a sodden, heavy cloak, absorbing the mist that rose from the ground in ghostly tendrils. The landscape had undergone a sickly metamorphosis. The warm, dusty golds and deep greens of the forest were gone, replaced by a palette of murky, oppressive hues. The air hung thick, tasting of decay and wet earth, and carried a chill that seeped through the lion's hide and into Hercules' bones. He was no longer alone. A figure waited for him at the edge of the wetlands, Iolaus, his nephew, young and earnest, his face pale in the gloomy light. No words of greeting were exchanged. A look of grim understanding passed between them. Iolaus had come as guide and companion, a slender reed of support in this shifting, treacherous place. Together, they turned from the firm road and stepped onto the spongy ground that marked the beginning of the marshes. The world dissolved into a labyrinth of water and rotten land. Narrow channels of still, black water wound between hummocks of sickly grass and beds of reeds that stood like ranks of rusted spears. The sky was a low ceiling of uniform gray, pressing down upon the scene. Gnarled cypress trees rose from the water, their roots exposed like the tangled veins of some submerged leviathan, coated in slimy moss. Their foliage was a dark, bruised green, casting deeper pools of shadow on the water below. The silence here was not the watchful quiet of Nemea, but an oppressive, damp hush, broken only by the occasional plop of a frog or the distant, lonely cry of a water bird. Iolaus led the way with a cautious certainty, picking a path along slightly firmer ground, sometimes using the monstrous cypress roots as makeshift bridges over the darker channels. Hercules followed, his every footfall sinking slightly into the muck, the suction pulling at his sandals. The mist coiled around their legs, cold and clinging. It was a primordial place, a fragment of the world before order, where water and land contested in a slow, stagnant war. They found the poison spring an hour into their journey. It was a small, clear pool, welling up from between two stones, but the water was wrong. A faint, iridescent sheen like oil, shimmered on its surface, and the stones around its lip were stained a lurid yellowish green. The vegetation nearby was withered and blackened, as if touched by frost in the height of summer. A dead heron lay half submerged at the pool's edge, its feathers dull and matted. This was the Hydra's taint, a corruption seeping from its lair into the very land, a slow venom that killed not with fang but with presence. Further on, they came across more direct evidence. A low, muddy island was littered with bones, not the scattered remnants of natural predation, but piles of them, bovine skulls, the long spines of deer, the shattered pelvis of something larger. They were picked clean, bleached white by the elements, but their arrangement spoke of a feeder of immense and wasteful appetite. Some bones showed strange pitting and discoloration, as if dissolved by a potent acid. The air here smelled. Sharper, an acrid note cutting through the general rot. Iolaus paused, his young face drawn. Hercules merely looked, his expression hidden within the shadow of the lion's head hood. This was the toll. This was the harvest of the thing they sought. The dread built not with sound, but with the increasing foulness of the environment. The channels grew wider, the water stiller and darker, like pools of spilled ink. Patches of floating algae, a vibrant and sickly green, dotted the surface. The mist, which had been waist-high, now thickened into a true fog, reducing visibility to a dozen paces. Shapes loomed and dissolved in the gray. A stump became a crouching figure, a cluster of reeds a waiting multitude. The only constants were the sucking mud underfoot and the cold, wet air in their lungs. Iolaus stopped, holding up a hand. He pointed ahead, his finger trembling slightly. Through a sudden, brief rift in the fog, they saw it. A vast, flat expanse of open water like a black mirror. And in its center, a low, muddy mound, humped and irregular, bristling with pale, dead trees that were not trees at all, but the stripped, skeletal remains of ancient cypresses. Then the mist closed in again, swift and silent. They waited, breaths held. The silence was absolute. Even the frogs had ceased. A soft ripple broke the black water's surface near the mound. Then another, a few paces away. Then a third in a different spot. The ripples spread, intersecting in silent, expanding rings. The water around the central island began to stir, as if from a slow, submerged current. From the mist-covered water they rose. Not one, not two, but many. Serpentine necks, thick as a man's thigh and glistening with wet, scales the color of tarnished bronze and sickly moss. They emerged sinuously, the water sheeting from them without a sound. Each neck ended in a wedge-shaped head, jaws slightly agape, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. Eyes like chips of dull onyx reflected the flat gray light. One head, then three, then five more emerging until a hideous thicket of them swayed above the water, moving with a horrible, synchronized languor. They did not hiss. They simply were, a nest of living nightmares born from the marsh's foul heart, tasting the air with flickering black tongues. The Hydra had seen them. The many heads turned with a chilling, unified purpose towards the spot where Hercules and Iolaus stood frozen on the bank. The primordial dread crystallized into a cold, sharp point of reality. The labor was no longer a story. It waited for them in the silent, mist-shrouded water. The battle was not a prolonged clash, but a swift, brutal exchange of elemental strategy. As the nest of heads swayed forward, Necks elongating over the black water, Hercules moved. He waded in, the cold muck swallowing his legs to the knees. The central head, larger and crowned with a ragged frill, darted first, jaws gaping wide enough to engulf a man's skull. He met it with the lion's pelt wrapped around his left forearm, the impervious hide deflecting the strike, the force of the impact shuddering up his arm. His right hand, gripping a sword taken from a fallen soldier long ago, flashed out. The blade severed the neck cleanly. The head splashed into the water, its eyes already filming over. A second head struck from the side, and he severed it too. But even as the second head sank, the horror of the labor revealed itself. From the bloody stump of the first neck, the flesh bubbled and swelled, parting like a grotesque flower to reveal two new heads, smaller but just as vicious, their scales still slick with birth fluid. They hissed in unison, a sound like steam escaping a fissure. Another neck he cut sprouted a single replacement, its growth unnervingly swift. The water around the Hydra's body churned with the thrashing of the multiplying limbs. Hercules retreated a step, the mud sucking at his heels. The heads wove a snapping, hissing tapestry before him there. Numbers already greater than before. Iolaus, watching from the firmer bank, understood. The solution was not in the cut, but in the cautery. He had prepared for this. Striking flint against the steel of a dagger, he coaxed sparks into a bundle of dry reeds and oil-soaked cloth he had carried wrapped in leather. A tiny flame caught, grew, and licked hungrily at the prepared torch in his hand. He thrust it into the damp air, and the fire took hold with a soft asterisk whump, painting his young face in sudden, dancing orange light. Hercules saw the flame reflected in the Hydra's myriad eyes. He shifted his grip on the sword, using it now as a tool of deflection, parrying the snapping strikes, creating an opening. As a head lunged, he sidestepped and grabbed it just below the jaw, his fingers digging into the slick scales. With a grunt of effort, he hauled it backward, stretching the neck taut over the water towards the bank. Iolaus did not hesitate. He lunged forward, thrusting the flaming torch against the base of the exposed neck. The sizzle was loud, a violent protest of flesh against fire. The stench of burning scale and cooked meat erupted, thick and gagging. The head writhed, then went limp. Hercules released it, and it sank. No new growth bubbled from the blackened, seared stump. The true labor began then. It was not the monster, but the environment. The choking smoke from the burning pitch and reptilian flesh mixed with the marsh mist, creating an acrid fog that burned the eyes and clawed at the throat. Each time Hercules dragged a thrashing head to the bank for Iolaus to sear, the process repeated. The hiss and sizzle, the nauseating smell, the burst of smoke. The air grew thick and toxic. Hercules' world narrowed to the cycle of grab, pull, hold. The mud of the bank became a churned, bloody quagmire, sucking at his feet, sapping his strength with every step. Sweat and marsh water streamed down his face. The lion's pelt grew heavy with muck and gore. The central head, the immortal one, watched with a cold intelligence, hanging back behind the forest of its offspring. As the numbers dwindled, it grew more aggressive, striking with sudden, venomous speed. Hercules, his arms aching from the strain of holding the powerful necks, finally saw his chance. Ducking under a strike from a smaller head, he bowled forward through the chest-deep water, closing the distance to the main body, a vast, indistinct bulk beneath the surface. The great head struck down like a hammer. He caught it on the pell-trapped forearm again, the impact driving him backward, but his other hand shot out and locked around the neck just below the jaw. The Hydra's body thrashed, roiling the water into a frenzy. With a roar that tore through the smoky air, Hercules wrenched the monstrous head sideways and pinned it against the half-submerged, rotten trunk of a dead cypress. He held it there, the muscles in his back and shoulders standing out like cables, while Iolaus scrambled along the trunk, torch held high. The final application of fire was a prolonged, furious blaze. The immortal head did not die, but its struggles ceased, its eyes glazing over with a stunned, defeated opacity. Hercules released it, and it lay still against the blackened wood. Exhaustion hit them like a physical wave. The marsh was a scarred and smoking ruin. The water was littered with floating, lifeless heads and the still seeping stumps of necks. The air reeked of a butcher's yard visited by lightning. Hercules, breathing in ragged gulps, waded to the Hydra's main bulk. With a final, grim effort, he plunged his sword into the soft underbelly and carved out the beast's venom sac, a pulsating, greenish-black organ. He carried it carefully to the bank, where Iolaus had sunk to his knees, retching from the fumes. There in the foul mud, Hercules performed a quiet, significant act. He took his arrows, one by one, and dipped their bronze points into the viscous, poisonous gall that oozed from the sack. The liquid clung to the metal, a dark, glossy coating that promised a death beyond mere piercing. It was the harvesting of a weapon from the weapon itself, a transmutation of the monster's essence into a tool for labors yet to come. He worked in silence, his large hands moving with a careful, deliberate precision that contrasted with the prior violence. When it was done, he buried the empty sack deep in the muck. The two men then simply sat, a few paces apart on the less trampled bank. They did not look at each other. Hercules stared at his poison-tipped arrows lying on the clean cloth beside him. Iolaus gazed at the smoldering torch now dying in the mud. Their chests rose and fell in slow, weary rhythm. No victory song rose from the marshes. There was only the residual crackle of cooling flesh, the gentle lap of disturbed water settling, and the overwhelming, bone-deep weariness of a task completed in filth and fire. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the mist began to clear. A feeble grayish light filtered through from the high clouds, touching the scarred landscape. The channel waters, no longer churned by the Hydra's thrashing, grew still once more, though they would never again be clean. The land was quiet, holding the memory of the violence in its scorched earth and poisoned mud. The two men sat in their silent exhaustion, a part of the ruin now, waiting for the strength to rise and leave the marshes behind. The marshes of Lerna clung to Hercules like a foul memory, the scent of smoke and venom slowly giving way to the dry, clean air of the uplands. His path turned northwest into the heart of Arcadia, a land of rolling hills and deep, quiet forests. The weight of the lion's pelt felt different here, not a shield against corruption, but a cloak for a hunter whose quarry demanded not force, but infinite patience. The decree had been specific: bring the hind of Cerynea alive to Mycenae, unharmed. It was a labor that would test not his strength, but his endurance, his restraint, and his respect for the sacred. He first saw her at dawn, a week into his search, in a high meadow silvered with dew. She stood at the tree line, a creature of ethereal beauty, as if fashioned from captured sunlight and forest shadow. Her coat was a rich, burnished gold, dappled with white spots like stars scattered across a tawny sky. But it was her antlers that stole the breath, not the branched crowns of a stag, but sweeping, gleaming arcs of solid gold that caught the first rays of the sun and held them, casting a soft, metallic glow upon the grass around her hooves. She was not merely an animal, she was a consecrated thing, a beloved pet of the goddess Artemis, and her every line spoke of divine grace and untouchable freedom. She saw him, too, her head lifted, ears swiveling forward. For a long moment they regarded each other across the meadow, hunter and myth. Then, with a fluid, effortless motion, she turned and vanished into the forest, a flash of gold and white swallowed by green shadow. There was no panic in her flight, only a serene, absolute certainty of escape. Hercules did not give chase. He knew already that this would not be a sprint, but a marathon of observation. Thus began the pursuit, a journey measured not in miles but in seasons. He tracked her across the breadth of Arcadia, a silent shadow in her wake. He learned her paths, the hidden deer trails that wound through thickets of myrtle and ash, the high ridges she favored at midday, the clear, cold streams where she drank at twilight. He moved with a deliberate slowness, often circling wide to anticipate her route, studying the delicate impressions of her cloven hooves in soft earth, the places where she had browsed on tender shoots. The forest became his world, its rhythms his own. He watched as spring's vibrant green deepened into summer's heavy, humid blanket. He saw the first hints of amber and scarlet touch the edges of the oak leaves, and felt the air grow crisp with the coming of autumn. He weathered the cold rains of late fall, huddled beneath the lion's pelt, watching the hind's golden form move like a flame through the gray drizzle. Winter brought a hushed, crystalline silence, and he tracked her through snow-dusted glens, her prints a delicate chain of jewels leading ever onward. Through it all, he never closed the final gap. He was a student of her habits, a witness to her existence. He saw her leap chasms with impossible grace, her golden antlers a blur against the sky. He watched her stand motionless for hours, blending into a thicket until she seemed a part of the dappled light itself. There was a profound respect in his observation. This was not an enemy to be conquered, but a spirit of the wild to be understood. The labor was the tracking itself, a year-long meditation on patience. The capture, when it finally came, was an act of gentle cunning, not violence. He had driven her over the course of days, towards a narrow, rocky defile he had scouted months before, a place where the slopes were too steep for her agile leaps, funneling her towards a natural cul-de-sac. Even then, she almost slipped past him, a streak of gold between two boulders. But he had anticipated this too. With a surge of speed he had not used in all his months of patient stalking, he closed the distance, not to strike but to herd. Cornered at last in a small, sunlit bowl of rock and grass, she turned to face him. She was not terrified. Her large, dark eyes held a defiant, regal calm. Hercules approached slowly, his hands empty. He spoke no words, but his movements were deliberate and unthreatening. When he was within an arm's length, she made no move to bolt. It was as if, after a year of elusive dance, she acknowledged the inevitability of this moment. With exquisite care, he produced strong, supple cords of leather. Looping them with a practiced gentleness, he secured her golden antlers, not to trap her head, but to create a guiding tether. He bound her legs with equal caution, ensuring the bonds were firm enough to prevent flight but loose enough to cause no chafing or pain. She struggled only briefly, a few heartbeats of instinctive rebellion, then stilled, her sides heaving. He lifted her. She was surprisingly light, a bundle of tense muscle and warm fur, and settled her across his shoulders, her head resting against the lion's mane. Her scent was of clean sweat, crushed grass, and wild thyme. He carried her thus out of the Arcadian forests, beginning the long walk back to Mycenae. The labor was complete. There was no triumphant roar, no trophy of a slain beast. There was only the quiet weight of the sacred animal, the memory of a year spent in silent, respectful pursuit, and the profound understanding that some victories are measured not in force, but in the unwavering, enduring will to follow without harming, to capture without breaking. The Hind of Cerynea, alive and unharmed, was the proof. Winter had claimed the high peaks of Arcadia, transforming the forested slopes Hercules knew into a realm of silent, crystalline austerity. His breath plumed in the thin, knife-sharp air, each exhalation a fleeting ghost against the immense white stillness. Mount Erymanthus rose before him, a jagged giant draped in snow so pure it hurt the eyes under the hard blue dome of the sky. The journey upward was a labor in itself. Each step broke through a crust of ice into powder that swallowed his feet to the calf. The crunch and squeak of compacting snow, the only sound in a world hushed by the season's weight. He climbed for hours, the lion's pelt now a damp, frost-strimed mantle. The cold was a pervasive presence, seeping through the golden hide to tighten his skin and ache in the joints of his fingers wrapped around his club. Below, the world was a patchwork of white and deep green forest. Here, near the tree line, only skeletal firs remained, their branches bowed under thick loads of snow that occasionally slipped free in soft, whispering avalanches. The silence was profound, a vast white noise that seemed to swallow all thought, leaving only the rhythm of his climb and the burning in his lungs. He found the boar's sign not by sight, but by the devastation left in its wake. A grove of young pines looked as if a whirlwind of pure force had passed through. Trunks snapped like twigs. The snow churned into a filthy, muddy morass studded with hoof prints as wide as a man's hand. The tracks led upward, towards a barren, windswept basin of rock and deep snowdrifts. This was no ordinary beast. The Erymanthian Boar was a creature of legend, a mountain incarnate, its tusks said to be curved like sickles and capable of shearing through oak. Hercules' task was not to slay it, but to capture it alive and bring it down, a labor of driving and cunning. He followed the trail into the basin, a broad, bowl-shaped expanse where the snow lay deep and undisturbed, glittering. Under the sun, the boar was there, a vast, dark shape rooting at the base of a cliff. Seen from a distance, it seemed less an animal and more a piece of the mountain itself given animate form, a shaggy, iron-gray mass of muscle and bristle, its shoulders higher than a man's waist, its small, red-rimmed eyes gleaming with a dim, primordial intelligence. It paused its digging, sensing him. A low, rumbling grunt vibrated through the frozen air, a sound of pure, territorial warning. Hercules did not advance. He circled wide, moving along the rim of the basin, using outcrops of rock for cover. The boar watched him, its snout dripping ice and dirt, its breath steaming in aggressive snorts. The strategy was clear in Hercules' mind. Not confrontation, but containment. He needed to drive the creature into the deepest snow, where its great weight and short legs would become its prison. He began by loosening a shelf of snow above the boar's position, with a well-aimed blow from his club. Small avalanche cascaded down, not enough to bury it, but enough to startle and annoy. The boar shook the powder from its back and charged the slope, not at Hercules, but at the disturbance, its tusks gouging furrows in the frozen earth. Hercules moved again, now from the other side, his voice cutting the silence. Not a shout, but a deep, resonant yell that echoed off the basin walls. The boar turned, confused, its charge redirected. Again and again, Hercules harried it, a relentless, shifting presence, always herding it away from the rocky edges and towards the center of the bowl where the snow was softest and deepest. The boar's rage grew with each feint and provocation. It would charge, a terrifying avalanche of flesh and fury, plowing through drifts that reached its belly, only to find Hercules had melted back, forcing it to turn in the exhausting stuff. The snow, initially a minor hindrance, became a tangible foe. Each charge grew shorter, more labored. The beast's snorts turned to wheezes, its hot breath melting craters in the white. Hercules, his own legs burning from the effort of moving through the deep powder, watched as the boar, in a final, furious attempt to gore him, launched itself into a particularly deep drift between two rocks. Its momentum carried it forward, but then stopped dead. It thrashed, a colossal engine stuck in a white quagmire. The more it struggled, the deeper it sank, the packed snow gripping its barrel chest and massive haunches like icy cement. Soon only its head and the curve of its back were visible, heaving with exhausted rage, its tusks impotently cleaving air. The capture was then a matter of careful, exhausting work. Hercules approached from behind, the snow giving way beneath him. Using his club as a lever and his own immense strength, he managed to loop strong ropes around the boar's hind legs and then its snout, tying its jaws shut to prevent it from biting through the bonds. The beast's struggles were weakening, its body heat melting a prison of slush around it. Finally subdued, it lay panting, its sides heaving, steam rising from its hide in great clouds. The labor of carrying it down the mountain began. Hercules hauled the massive, sodden creature from its snowy trap, and with a final, grating effort, hoisted it across his shoulders. The weight was astonishing, a crushing, living burden that dwarfed even the lion's pelt. The cold wetness of its hide seeped through his tunic, a clammy chill that bit to the bone. Every step down the treacherous slope was a test of balance and sheer muscular endurance. His thighs trembled with the strain. His back became a single burning knot of tension. The boar's heat and the smell of wet animal, pine, and cold earth filled his senses. He moved in a world reduced to the crunch of his own footsteps, the ragged sound of his breath, and the vast, white silence of the winter mountain watching his slow, ponderous descent. The first sign of the fifth labor was not a sight but a smell. It found Hercules on the wind as he descended from the clean, snow-scoured heights of Erymanthus into the rolling plains of Elis. It began as a faint, earthy tang, a note of distant barnyard carried on the breeze. With each eastward mile, the note deepened, strengthened, and multiplied into a complex, overwhelming chord of decay. It was the smell of 1,000 midden heaps baking in the sun, of generations of confinement and neglect, of life reduced to its basest, most stagnant residue. It was a wall of odor long before the valley of Augean came into view. When the land finally opened before him, Hercules stopped. The valley was a study in overwhelming sepia and dun, a geological scale testament to entropy. The once fertile basin lay under a permanent, hazy pall. The very light stained a dirty amber as it filtered through the miasma rising from the ground. The river Alpheus, which should have been a silver ribbon threading the plain, was a sluggish, brown trickle. Its banks lost under crumbling, dried berms of waste. Its sister, the Peneus, was no better, a choked, meandering ditch of sludge. The air hummed with flies, a constant, droning veil that blurred the outlines of distant shapes. And the shapes themselves defied belief. What from a distance might have been low hills or strange, terraced earthworks revealed themselves to be mountains, not of stone, but of manure. Vast, sloping accumulations, hardened at their crusts into cracked, grayish plates, steaming faintly from their interiors. They dotted the valley floor like the burial mounds of a filthy, forgotten civilization. Between them, the land was a barren, trampled waste, stripped of all grass, cut with deep, muddy runnels where liquid filth had flowed during rains. Heracles' eyes, sharpened by months of tracking subtle signs in wilderness, now took in the staggering scale of neglect. He saw the source of it all, the stables themselves. They were not a single building, but a vast, rambling complex of stone and timber stretching along the valley's length, their roofs sagging, their walls stained to shoulder height with a dark, permanent patina. And emerging from their dark mouths, flowing in a slow, pathetic tide, came the herds. They were countless, cattle with hides matted and eyes dull with a bovine resignation, their ribs showing even through their bulk. Sheep, their wool a solid, filthy mass of brown, huddled together for lack of clean pasture. Goats picked listlessly at the bare earth. Horses, their majestic forms reduced to sway-backed skeletons, stood heads lowered in the perpetual shade of the waste heaps. The sound was a low, constant symphony of mournful lows, weak bleats, and the squelch of countless hooves in muck. It was a vision of unparalleled abundance turned to unparalleled wretchedness, a kingdom whose wealth was its own curse. King Augean, in his hubris, had let his divine herds, a gift from his father Helios, multiply without care, believing the task of cleaning their home to be beneath him and impossible for any mortal. The valley was the physical manifestation of that arrogance, a crime against the land itself. Hercules stood for a long time observing. He did not cover his nose. He let the full, rotten bouquet fill his lungs, a sensory understanding of the labor. This was not a monster to be strangled or a sacred beast to be outwitted. This was a systemic foulness, a corruption woven into the very geography. His gaze moved from the pathetic animals to the towering mounds of waste, to the choked, dying rivers, and back to the stable complex. The sheer volume was the problem. To move it by hand, even with 1,000 men and 100 years, would be a Sisyphean nightmare. Then his gaze settled on the two rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus. They flowed from the clean, snow-fed mountains of Arcadia to the north and west, entering the valley still pure before being strangled by the king's neglect. He traced their courses. With his eyes noting the lay of the land, the gentle slope of the valley floor towards the south. A pivotal, intellectual moment crystallized in the silence. The solution was not in moving the filth. It was in moving the water. The rivers themselves, those bringers of life, could be turned into instruments of catharsis. By diverting their courses, channeling their combined power through the stables and across the manure-choked fields, he could accomplish in a day what armies could not in a lifetime. It was an act of hydrological engineering, a repurposing of nature's own forces to scour clean the sins of a king. The labor, he understood then, would be one of immense, directed strength, of stone and sinew applied not to destruction, but to purification. A grim satisfaction, cold and clear, cut through the stench. He had seen the method. Now he had only to move the mountains, not of dung, but of water. The plan existed as a clean, geometric certainty in Hercules' mind, a stark contrast to the organic chaos surrounding him. He turned from the overwhelming vista of decay and began to walk the valley's perimeter, his eyes measuring slopes and gradients with the precision of a surveyor. The labor would be one of immense, solitary exertion, a dialogue between his strength and the stubborn earth. He sought not tools, but raw materials, boulders of sufficient size, tracts of firm clay, stands of sturdy timber. He began at the northern rim, where the Alpheus, still clear and swift, entered the befouled basin. Selecting a point where the riverbank was high and the bedrock near the surface, he set to work. His first task was to construct a temporary dam, a bulwark to halt the river's flow and force it towards a new course. The stones he chose were not pebbles but slabs, some as large as ox carts, half buried in the alluvial soil. He dug them free with his hands and the leverage of his club, the muscles in his back and shoulders knotting with the strain. Lifting one, he would carry it, staggering slightly under the weight to the chosen site, heaving it into place with a grunt that echoed dully in the thick air. He worked methodically, layering stone upon stone, chinking gaps with smaller rocks and packed clay dredged from the bank. Sweat sheened his skin, cutting trails through the dust and grime already clinging to him. The flies found him, a persistent, buzzing cloud, but he ignored them, his world reduced to the next stone, the next placement. Hours passed. The dam rose, a rough but formidable barrier. The Alpheus, confused, began to pool behind it, its murmur rising to a low, restless roar as the water sought escape. Hercules then turned to excavation. With a massive timber as a pry, he began to dig a new channel, a deep, straight trench angling down from the dam's eastern flank, aiming directly for the heart of the stable complex a mile distant. The earth here was harder, a mix of compacted clay and gravel. He worked like a human plow, the timber tearing great clods free, his hands following to cast the spoil aside. The trench deepened, his body moving in a rhythm of heave and throw, heave and throw. The sun climbed, beating down on the valley, cooking the miasma into a visible, shimmering haze. The stench was a physical presence, but he moved through it as if through a familiar fog, his focus absolute. By midday, the new channel for the Alpheus was ready. With a final, thunderous heave, he dislodged a key stone from the center of his dam. The river, pent up and powerful, found the gap. With a sound like a sustained avalanche, the water exploded through, a foaming brown torrent that hit the head of the newly dug trench and plunged down it, carving the sides smoother as it went. The roar was immense, a triumphant shout of hydrologic force. Hercules stood aside, chest heaving, watching the Alpheus obey his will, a raging liquid spear aimed at the heart of the filth. He did not rest. He moved south and west to the Peneus. The process repeated. The selection of a site, the hauling of boulders, the construction of a second, smaller dam, the digging of a second trench designed to converge with the first just upstream from the stables. This labor was harder, his body already fatigued, the muscles in his arms trembling with the memory of strain. But he drove himself on, the vision of the cleansing surge propelling him. As the afternoon light began to slant, the second dam was complete, the second trench dug. He released the Peneus. It joined the Alpheus in a confluence of roaring water, their combined currents merging into a single, devastating torrent. Now came the catharsis. Hercules climbed to a rocky promontory overlooking the stable yards. Below him, the Twin River torrent, a churning, mud-brown giant, reached the first of the stone buildings. It hit the open stable doors and flowed inside, a relentless, searching force. The sound changed from a roar to a deep, gulping tumult as the water filled spaces that had known only dry filth for decades. He watched as the centuries-old accumulations inside began to dissolve. The hardened crusts of the manure mountains softened, then slumped, then were simply swept away. The water carved through the waste like a knife through rotten fruit, carrying it off in swirling, dark rivers that spread across the valley floor, scouring the trampled earth down to bare, clean stone and hard-packed subsoil. The sensory rush was overwhelming. The thunder of the water was a constant physical vibration in the air and ground. A fine, cool spray, thrown up by the churning, reached Hercules on his perch, a blessed relief against his fevered skin. The smell itself began to transform. The cloying, stagnant odor of decay was ripped away by the moving air, replaced by the clean, mineral scent of wet earth and stone, the ancient smell of a river doing its primordial work. He saw the choked, original courses of the Alpheus and Peneus begin to fill with the diverted flow, their banks washing clean, the water within them gradually clearing from brown to a silt gray, and finally to a mere murkiness that promised eventual purity. He worked until dusk, not with the rivers now, but as a director of the flood, using his strength to clear blockages, a collapsed lintel, a jam of debris, ensuring the water reached every cloistered corner, every sunken pen. As the sun dipped below the western hills, painting the cleared steam in the air with hues of orange and purple, the torrent's work was largely done. The valley lay spent and dripping. The mountains of dung were gone. The stable buildings, their stones scrubbed raw and pale, stood empty and echoing. The herds, confused but quiet, stood on patches of higher ground, their feet on wet but clean earth, the terrible burden of their own existence washed away downstream. Hercules descended from his perch. He was a figure of mud and sweat, every muscle screaming, his hands raw and bleeding in places. He waded through the shallow, rushing aftermath, the water cool around his ankles. He felt a unique satisfaction, different from any before. It was not the grim triumph over a monster, nor the patient victory of a chase. It was the clean, unambiguous satisfaction of a purifying labor completed, of a wrong made right through sheer, applied force and intellect. The land was refreshed. The water, once a bringer of death through stagnation, now flowed clear, its sound a gentle, healing murmur in the twilight. He stood in the center of the cleansed valley, a solitary giant in the gathering dark, and for a moment the weight upon his soul felt just a fraction lighter, scoured clean by the river's roar. The purifying rush of the Alpheus and Peneus was a memory held in the clean lines of muscle and the lingering scent of wet stone. Hercules moved eastward, leaving the cleansed valley of Elis for a landscape that seemed its antithesis. The air grew thick and heavy, losing the crispness of the mountains and the fertile damp of the plains, acquiring instead a metallic tang that coated the tongue. The ground underfoot turned soft and spongy, giving way to the fringes of a vast, stagnant marsh. This was Lake Stymphalus, but it bore no resemblance to the lively, reed-fringed waters of other regions. The lake was a sheet of dull, leaden water, unmoved by wind or current, reflecting the gray sky with a sickly sheen like tarnished pewter. Ancient, skeletal trees rose from the muck, their bark stripped away, their branches bare and black as iron. The silence was not peaceful but dead, as if the very air had been suffocated. Hercules paused at the marsh's edge, his senses straining. It was the silence that felt wrong, a vacuum that seemed to press against the ears. Then he heard it, not a single sound but a multitude, a distant metallic clattering like 10,000 sheets of beaten bronze being shaken at once. It was a sound without rhythm or melody, a dissonant, nerve-shredding cacophony that seemed to vibrate in the teeth and skull. It came from the far side of the lake, where a dense, dark cloud seemed to hover above the dead trees. The birds of Stymphalus. He moved cautiously along the boggy shore. The clatter grew louder, resolving into a horrifying symphony of shrieks, clicks, and the relentless, deafening clash of metal on metal. As he drew nearer, he saw them. They were not creatures of feather and flesh, but nightmares of artifice. They perched in the dead trees by the hundreds, each the size of a large hawk, but their bodies were sheathed in overlapping plates of bronze that gleamed dully in the flat light. Their wings were sharp-edged blades, their beaks and talons forged of the same unyielding metal. They did not sing. They clashed. They struck their own bodies with their beaks, rattled their wings against their sides, and slammed into one another in a perpetual, mindless agitation, generating the wall of noise that had sterilized the landscape. Their eyes were tiny, bright pinpoints of malice in their metallic faces. The ground beneath their roosts was littered with fallen, razor-sharp bronze feathers, like a harvest of daggers, and with the bones of creatures, and perhaps men, who had ventured too close, shredded by the deadly hail. The auditory horror was overwhelming. The noise was a physical assault, hammering against Hercules' senses, making thought difficult, turning the marsh into a disorienting chamber of echoes. He could not approach, A single step into the open would bring a storm of diving, slicing metal upon him. He crouched behind the rotten trunk of a fallen cypress, the lion's pelt pulled close. The labor was clear, to drive them from their roost. But how does one fight sound? How does one confront a plague of noise? As if in answer to the silent question, a soft, solid weight thumped onto the marshy ground beside him. He looked down. There lay a pair of crotala large bronze clappers, the kind used in the worship of Cybele or Dionysus. They were intricately worked, gifts from the goddess Athena, whose wisdom favored clever solutions over brute force. He picked them up. They were heavy, perfectly balanced. Their purpose was not to harm the birds, but to outshout them. Hercules rose from his hiding place. He stepped into the open, the terrible clatter immediately focusing upon him. Several birds took to the air, their bronze wings beating with a sound like swords being sharpened. He raised the clappers high above his head and brought them together with all his strength. The sound they produced was not a clang, but a profound, resonant crack that cut through the metallic din like thunder through the chatter of rain. It was a pure, percussive note of divine authority. The effect was instantaneous. The birds froze in their trees, their own noise ceasing for a single, blessed heartbeat. Then, as one, they erupted into a frenzy of panic. The crack came again, and again. Hercules beat the clappers together in a relentless, deafening rhythm that was the antithesis of their chaotic clatter. It was order imposed upon madness, a sound so commanding it could not be ignored. The bronze-feathered flock could not endure it. With a collective shriek that was almost lost beneath the divine percussion, they took flight. Thousands of them rose from the dead trees in a roaring, metallic cloud, their wings now beating not in aggression, but in terrified flight. The sky darkened with their numbers, the sun glinting coldly off their plates. The hail of sharp feathers fell around Hercules, but he stood firm, a solitary figure driving a storm of metal and noise into the heavens with each mighty clash of the crotala. He drove them east, towards the open sea, the sound of the clappers pursuing them like a wrathful spirit. Gradually, the terrible cloud diminished, becoming a speck on the horizon, and then nothing. The last echoes of the crotala faded. Hercules lowered his arms, the muscles trembling from the effort. He let the clappers fall to the soft earth. Silence returned to the marshes of Stymphalus, but it was a new silence, profound and sweet. It was the absence of that horrific noise, a void that felt like a balm. The ringing in his ears slowly subsided, replaced by the gentle lap of water against the shore, the whisper of a real breeze through the reeds, the distant, tentative call of a living frog from a pool now unpoisoned by sound. The oppressive weight lifted from the land. The leaden water seemed to shimmer with a softer light. The labor was complete. It had been a battle not of strength, but of sonic will, a restoration of peace through the imposition of a greater, purer noise. He stood amidst the fallen bronze feathers, breathing in the quiet, feeling the sweet, profound relief of silence settle over the cleansed marsh. The silence of Stymphalus, so hard-won and sweet, was a memory cradled in the mind as Hercules turned his face south, toward the scent of salt and the vast, sighing expanse of the Augean. The labor demanded a sea voyage, a shift in rhythm from the rooted struggles of land to the fluid, trackless realm of Poseidon. At a small port in the Peloponnese, he secured a sturdy, single-sailed merchant vessel, its hull stained by brine and its crew a handful of weathered men who spoke little and watched the hero with a mix of awe and trepidation. They cast off at dawn, the ropes slapping against the quay, the sail catching a morning breeze that smelled of dried fish and tar. The rhythm of the journey was set by the sea and the oars. Once beyond the sheltered bay, the true Augean opened before them, a boundless plain of shifting, deep blue silk, rumpled by a steady wind. Hercules took a bench among the rowers, his massive hands wrapping around an oar as thick as a young tree. He pulled in time with the others, the motion a simple, profound meditation. The creak of the oarlocks, the synchronized. Splash and pull, the groan of the timbers. These became the world's only sounds. His land-bound muscles, accustomed to climbing and lifting, learned a new language of repetitive, liquid resistance. Sweat beaded on his brow, only to be whisked away by the constant, clean wind. The sun, a fierce white coin, tracked across a sky of impossible blue, its light flashing off the wave caps in blinding shards. Dolphins sometimes raced the bow, their sleek forms cutting the water with joyful grace, a reminder of the sea's benevolent life. For 2 days and nights, they followed the star paths and the captain's quiet commands. On the morning of the third day, a smudge appeared on the southern horizon, a line of deeper blue against the blue. It solidified, rising from the waves like a sleeping leviathan. Crete. The island emerged in layers. First the distant, hazy mountains, then the green foothills, and finally the white stone walls of Knossos, gleaming like a scatter of bones on a sun-baked slope. The sight stirred something in Hercules, not dread but a weary recognition. Another kingdom, another king, another task. Disembarking at the bustling port, he moved with direct purpose through streets thronged with merchants and fishermen, the air rich with the smells of spices, olive oil, and sun-baked stone. His reputation preceded him. Guards at the palace of King Minos merely nodded him through, their eyes wide. The audience was brief. Minos, a man whose authority was etched in the lines of his face and the cold gleam of his crown, received the hero in a sunlit courtyard. The king's divine bull, a gift from Poseidon, was a treasure and a symbol. Yet when Hercules stated his demand, born of Eurystheus's decree, Minos did not refuse. Perhaps he saw the futility of denial in the hero's weary eyes, or perhaps he relished the challenge posed to the beast's captor. With a wave of a ringed hand, he granted permission. The capture itself was swift, almost anticlimactic. The bull was found in a royal paddock, a creature of astonishing power and beauty, its coat a sleek, storm-cloud gray, its horns great curved scimitars of polished ebony. It was powerful enough to have sired the Minotaur, a creature of primal force. Yet when Hercules approached, calm and deliberate, the animal did not rage. It allowed a heavy rope to be fixed about its mighty neck, as if acknowledging a superior strength, or perhaps the inevitability of its own legendary role. There was no struggle, only a deep, resonant snort that fogged the air. The true heart of the labor revealed itself on the return voyage. The bull stood placidly on the deck of the small ship, its hooves planted wide for balance on the swaying planks. Hercules sat nearby, his back against the mast, the rope coiled loose in his hand. The crew gave the animal a wide berth, but their fear proved unnecessary. The bull was a picture of serene power, its great head turning to watch the flight of seabirds, its dark eyes reflecting the endless sky. It seemed to enjoy the spray, occasionally lowering its muzzle to snuff at the salt mist. And so they sailed north, a strange, peaceful company. The days were a cycle of gentle motion, the nights a dome of stars so dense and close they seemed a net of frozen silver cast over the world. Hercules spent hours simply sitting with the animal, this destined beast, under the vast, changing sky. It was a moment of pastoral tranquility utterly foreign to his labors. There was no enemy here, no filth to cleanse, no sacred law to obey with painful restraint. There was only the rhythmic sigh of the sea, the creak of the ship, the warm, living bulk of the bull, and the immense, quiet arc of the heavens. He studied the animal, the way its muscles shifted under its hide with the ship's roll, the intelligent stillness in its gaze, the sheer, calm presence of it. This was no monster to be subdued, but a magnificent creature caught in the web of gods and kings, a passive passenger on a journey not of its choosing. Hercules felt a kinship in that. They were both beings of immense strength, bound to paths laid down by others, carried across profound depths toward an unknown fate on a distant shore. The sunsets were particularly breathtaking, painting the bull's gray coat in hues of rose and gold, transforming it into a statue of living bronze against the fiery water. When the Peloponnesian coast finally appeared, a line of familiar green and brown, the interlude ended. The tranquility of the deep water gave way to the practicalities of approach, the shouted commands of the captain, the bustle of the return to the world of tasks and burdens. Hercules rose, his muscles stiff from sitting. He placed a hand on the bull's broad forehead, feeling the solid bone beneath, a final acknowledgement of their shared, silent journey. Then he took up the rope, his expression settling once more into the familiar, resolute lines of the laborer. The strange peace of the Augean was folded away, a quiet memory stored in the heart, as he led the divine bull down the gangplank onto the solid, demanding earth. The sea's tranquil memory dissolved into the grim, wind-scoured reality of Thrace. Hercules traveled north and east, beyond the familiar contours of the Hellenic world, into a land where the sky seemed lower, a ceiling of bruised gray clouds driven by a constant, keening wind that smelled of cold stone and distant, untamed steppes. The landscape was one of harsh beauty and implicit violence. Vast, treeless plains of coarse grass bent flat by the gale, broken by jagged outcrops of dark rock and deep, shadowed ravines. It was a kingdom of edges, ruled by a king of edges. Diomedes, son of Ares, was less a monarch than a force of nature, a man whose cruelty was as legendary as the four possessions he cherished above all else, his mares. Hercules crested a rocky ridge and looked down upon the king's domain. It was not a palace complex, but a fortified stockade of rough-hewn timber and piled stone, crouched in the lee of a cliff like a predator's den. From this distance, the scene appeared almost pastoral. 4 horses grazed in a broad, stony paddock enclosed by a fence of sharpened logs. They were magnificent creatures, even from afar, taller and more powerfully built than any war horse of Greece. their coats a shimmering, restless black that drank the weak light. Their manes and tails streamed like banners in the relentless wind. But the pastoral illusion shattered as the wind shifted, carrying up from the compound a scent that stopped Hercules cold. It was not the smell of a stable, nor of grass, nor of clean animal sweat. It was the iron-rich, sickly sweet odor of old blood and spoiled meat, so potent it cut through the clean, cold air like a knife. He descended the slope, the wind whipping the lion's pelt around his legs. As he drew nearer, the details of the paddock resolved into horror. The ground within the enclosure was not earth but a churned, dark muck. Scattered about, gleaming whitely against the filth, were bones. Not the clean-picked skeletons of pasture, but bones that were cracked and splintered from marrow, skulls that were crushed like eggshells. They were human bones, some still trailing ragged scraps of flesh and cloth, the final remnants of the strangers and captives King Diomedes fed to his cherished steeds. The mares themselves moved with a strange, restless energy, their eyes rolling to show white rims, their nostrils flaring as they caught Hercules' scent. They were creatures of sublime beauty and profound corruption, their strength and spirit warped by a diet of human flesh, making them not just wild, but savagely, unnaturally carnivorous. Hercules understood the labor's dark core instantly. To capture these creatures, to break them to harness even for the journey, he would first have to break their master. The mares were merely the instruments. Diomedes was the source of the poison. The task was not one of animal husbandry, but of grim justice. He approached the stockade's heavy gate. Guards clad in wolf pelts and bearing notched axes watched him from a palisade, their faces hard and unsmiling. They did not challenge him. They simply opened the gate, their eyes averted, as if they knew his coming was an inevitable reckoning long overdue. Within the compound, the stench was overwhelming, a physical wall of decay. King Diomedes awaited him in a muddy courtyard, a giant of a man with a beard the color of rust and eyes like chips of flint. He wore a breastplate of boiled leather and held a spear tipped with a barbed Thracian point. He did not speak in threats or boasts. He merely smiled, a thin, cruel stretching of lips that acknowledged a kindred force of destruction, and attacked. The fight was short, brutal, and devoid of glory. It was a clash of two primal powers in a squalid yard. Diomedes fought with the frenzied, hacking fury of his war god father, but Hercules fought with the weary, efficient strength of a man performing a necessary but odious chore. He deflected the spear thrust with his club, closed the distance through the sucking mud, and grappled the king. There was no heroic monologue, no exchange of blows. It was a contest of raw leverage against berserk rage, settled in a few grunting, straining moments. Hercules subdued him, binding the king's wrists and ankles with the same thick ropes he had brought for the mares. What followed happened away from the narrative's eye, in the shadowed corner of the foul paddock. Hercules performed the act with a cold, procedural detachment that was more haunting than any rage. He led the bound, struggling king to the fence. The mares, smelling the familiar scent of their feeder, grew agitated, stamping and snorting, their teeth bared. The focus is not on the feeding itself, but on Hercules' face as he turned away from the sound. His expression was not one of vengeance, nor satisfaction, nor even disgust. It was a profound, empty solemnity, the look of a man adding a heavier, darker stone to the cairn of burdens already crushing his soul. He had meted out a poetic justice, so stark it felt less like justice, and more like a further descent into the very brutality he was meant to cleanse. When he turned back, the mares were calm. They stood quietly, their unnatural frenzy spent, their great heads lowered. The fire in their eyes had banked to a dull, sated glow. They were tame, willing now to be led. But the taming was a tainting. Hercules approached them, looping strong halters about their necks. They followed him without resistance, their steps placid, their magnificent forms now forever associated with the atrocity that had subdued them. He led them from the stockade, past the silent, watching guards, and out onto the open plain. The wind, cleansed of the stockade's stench, now carried only the smell of cold grass and coming rain. He began the long walk south, dark shadows moving obediently at his back. He did not look at them. He stared instead at the horizon, his face set in lines of deep, unspoken fatigue. The labor was complete, the mares captured, but no victory lightened his step. The memory of the king's final moments, the passive calm of the monstrous horses, the entire grim economy of blood and control, it all settled upon him like a finer, more penetrating dust than the mud of the marshes or the ash of the Hydra's fire. It was a moral grime that no river could wash away. He walked on, a solitary figure leading his terrible prizes, a deeper, more permanent shadow etched upon his spirit by the wind-swept, grim lands of Thrace. The shadow of Thrace, a stain upon the spirit, began to lighten with the miles as Hercules journeyed eastward, following the southern curve of the Euxine Sea. The harsh, wind-scoured plains gave way to gentler, wooded shores, and the air lost its biting edge, growing soft with the scent of salt water and blooming oleander. His destination was a land spoken of in hushed, half-incredulous tones by sailors, Themyscira, the realm of the Amazons. This ninth labor, he had been told, was one of diplomacy. He was to request, not take, the war belt of their queen, Hippolyta, a girdle of exquisite craftsmanship given to her by Ares himself. After the grim butchery of Diomedes' mares, the prospect of a peaceful exchange felt like a reprieve, a chance to use words instead of strength, respect instead of force. He arrived at the mouth of the Thermodon River under a clear, azure sky. Themyscira was not a fortified city in the Greek sense, but a sprawling, open settlement of timber longhouses and training grounds nestled between the lush riverbank and the forested hills. The first sight of the Amazon stole the breath. They were everywhere practicing archery at straw targets, wrestling in sandy pits, grooming horses that were as sleek and powerful as their riders. They moved with a fluid, athletic grace, their bodies honed to a lethal perfection. They wore practical tunics of dyed linen or soft leather, their hair braided or bound back, their arms and legs adorned with simple bands of bronze or silver. There was no idleness here, only purposeful, vibrant activity. The atmosphere was not one of warlike menace, but of disciplined matriarchal order, a society complete unto itself, confident and serene. Hercules, a giant among men, felt strangely conspicuous, an anomaly in this world of feminine prowess. He announced himself at the outskirts, and after a brief, curious scrutiny from sentries who regarded him with calm assessment rather than fear, he was escorted to the heart of the settlement. Queen Hippolyta received him in a sun-dappled clearing by the river, seated on a simple carved stool. She was a vision of majestic authority. Tall and powerfully built, her bearing was regal without haughtiness. Her eyes were a clear, intelligent gray, and her dark hair was bound in a complex plait that fell over one shoulder. The famous girdle rested on her hips, a masterpiece of woven gold links and polished hematite plaques, a symbol of her martial sovereignty and her divine favor. She listened as Hercules, choosing his words with a care he seldom used, explained his errand, the labors imposed by Eurystheus, the nature of his request. To his surprise, she did not refuse. She considered him, her gaze thoughtful. She saw the weariness behind his eyes, the lion's pelt that spoke of other trials, the quiet dignity of his appeal. The Amazons revered heroic endeavor, and his labors, even imposed as penance, were worthy of respect. A mutual understanding seemed to pass between them, a bridge across the divide of gender and culture. She nodded, a slight, gracious inclination of her head. The girdle, she indicated, could be a token of alliance, a gift recognizing a fellow warrior's impossible path. The relief that washed over Hercules was profound, a warm flood after so long in cold, grim places. For a fleeting moment, the weight of his burdens felt shared, lightened by an unexpected act of grace. Then the wind changed. It was a subtle shift at first, a sudden chill in the warm afternoon air, a malicious whisper that slithered through the leaves of the riverside poplars. The clear light seemed to dim, not with cloud but with a creeping, psychic shadow. Hercules felt it, a familiar poisonous presence that coiled around his heart. Hera, his eternal stepmother, the architect of his suffering, could not abide this moment of peace, this potential for an easy victory earned through respect. Her divine spite, invisible but palpable, poured into the clearing like a fog. It struck the Amazons first. Where moments before there had been calm assessment, a sudden collective tension seized the warriors. Whispers, sharp and urgent, passed among them. The story, born from nothing and spread by the goddess's will, took root. The giant foreigner had come not to request, but to steal. He had deceived their queen. He meant to abduct her. The respectful atmosphere curdled into suspicion, then into a swift, hot blaze of protective fury. The change was terrifying in its completeness. Faces hardened. Hands dropped to sword hilts and bowstrings. Queen Hippolyta rose, her own expression shifting from contemplation to alarmed confusion as she sensed the change in her sisters. She tried to speak, to calm them, but the poisoned wind carried her words away, twisting them into further evidence of her enchantment by the stranger. Hercules saw the disaster unfolding, saw the goodwill he had nurtured shattered by an invisible, hateful hand. He raised his own hands, a gesture of peace, but it was too late. The attack was not a formal battle, but a sudden, violent eruption. An Amazon, her eyes blazing with righteous anger, loosed an arrow. It sang past Hercules' head. Another charged with a spear. The peaceful clearing exploded into chaos. Hercules, his heart a cold stone of regret, had no choice but to defend himself. He fought with a desperate, sorrowful efficiency, using his club to deflect, his strength to disarm and subdue, trying to minimize harm. But the Amazons were formidable. and in the press of bodies, the clash of bronze control was a fragile thing. He saw Hippolyta, caught in the melee, trying to rally her women to stop, her voice lost in the din. A thrown spear meant for Hercules found a different path in the chaos. The queen staggered, a look of profound surprise on her face, before falling to the trampled earth. The fight left the Amazons then, draining away into a stunned, horrible silence. The malicious wind died as suddenly as it had risen, leaving only the scent of blood and crushed grass. Hercules stood amidst the panting, wounded warriors, his club hanging limp at his side. He looked at the fallen queen, at the girdle upon her hips, now a symbol of catastrophic failure. The labor was complete, but the victory was ashes. He approached her body, the Amazons parting for him now in a haze of grief and shock. With gentle hands, he unbuckled the girdle of Ares from her waist. The gold links were cool, the hematite plaques dark as dried blood. He held it, this object of his quest, and it felt heavier than any monster, colder than the depths of the sea. It was a prize that tasted only of defeat, a token purchased with a life that should never have been spent. He turned away from the mourning women, from the beautiful, broken piece of Themyscira, and walked back toward the shore where his ship waited. The girdle was in his hand, a circlet of gold and shame, and the memory of the queen's gracious nod, and the malicious whisper that had stolen it, would haunt him longer than any roar of any beast. The shame of Themyscira was a private, corrosive weight, a burden of a different order than the physical ones Hercules bore. He carried it west, then further west, beyond the familiar contours of the Mediterranean world, toward a place that existed more in the whispers of sailors and the edges of maps than in geography. The 10th labor was a journey to the end of things, to the island of Erythea at the very edge of the known world, to fetch the cattle of the monster Geryon. It was less a task than an odyssey, a voyage into the realm of the fantastic, where the sky itself grew immense and lonely. He sailed from Tartessos, a port at the lip of the world, in a sturdy Phoenician trader whose captain knew the currents but feared the destination. For days, they followed the southern coast of Iberia, a line of sun-bleached cliffs and empty, golden shores. Then the land began to pinch together. Two great promontories rose from the sea, titanic sentinels of bare, rust-colored rock. These were the pillars of Hercules, the gateway to the outer ocean. As the ship sailed between them, the world changed. The sheltered, blue waters of the Middle Sea were left behind. Before them stretched the ocean, a vast, heaving plain of a deeper, more profound blue, its surface wrinkled by long, rolling swells that spoke of infinite depth and distance. The sky above was not a dome, but an endless, inverted bowl of palest azure, empty of clouds, empty of birds, holding only the blinding, white eye of the sun. The air grew cooler, sharper, carrying a clean, saline tang untouched by land smells. The wind had a constant, mournful voice here, a sigh across the face of the deep. The crew grew silent, their eyes wide, crossing themselves or murmuring prayers to gods who seemed very small in this immensity. For days they saw nothing but water and sky, a duality so complete it felt like sailing off the edge of a disk. Then on the morning of the 5th day, a smudge of deep violet appeared on the western horizon. It resolved slowly into an island, not green and welcoming, but a stark, dramatic silhouette of high, red cliffs and flat-topped mesas. Erythea. As they drew nearer, the color revealed itself. The very rock was a rich, burnt sienna, as if the island were a single, colossal ember glowing in the oceanic vastness. They found a narrow cove, a slash of dark water at the base of the cliffs, and anchored. Hercules went ashore alone in a small boat, the sound of the oars echoing strangely in the absolute quiet of the place. The island was a paradox of emptiness and life. The interior was a rolling, rocky plain covered in sparse, tough grass of a peculiar silver-green hue. And everywhere, grazing in small, tranquil groups, were the cattle. They were like no herd he had ever seen. Their hides were not brown or black, but a uniform, deep, russet red, the color of dried blood or sunset clouds. Their horns were long and lyre-shaped, polished to a gleaming ebony. They moved with a slow, peaceful dignity, their coats shimmering in the clear, hard light. They were beautiful, but their beauty was strange, otherworldly, as if they were not beasts of flesh but sculptures of tinted bronze brought to life. The only sounds were the sigh of the wind, the distant crash of surf, and the soft, contented lowing of the red cattle. There was no sign of a herdsman, no dog, no shelter. It was a pastoral scene of perfect, lonely serenity. Hercules began to gather the herd, moving among them with a quiet, deliberate calm. They were not skittish. They allowed him to guide them, their dark, liquid eyes watching him with a placid curiosity. He had collected perhaps 50 head, driving them gently toward the eastern shore where his ship waited when he felt it, a change in the pressure of the air, a deepening of the silence. The cattle around him grew still, their heads lifting in unison, not in alarm, but in recognition. He turned. On a low rise a quarter-mile distant, a figure stood. At first, Hercules thought it was a trick of the light, a grouping of 3 weathered stone pillars. Then the grouping moved. It resolved into a single being of impossible anatomy, Geryon. The monster was less a creature and more a monumental, almost geographical feature. From the waist down, he was a single, colossal form, 2 powerful legs, each thicker than an oak trunk, planted wide on the red earth. But from the waist erupted 3 separate torsos, joined at the hips and lower back, fanning out like the heads of a colossal Hydra. Each torso was muscled like a champion wrestler, clad in a simple kilt of undyed linen. Each bore a pair of powerful arms. And from the shoulders of each torso rose a neck and a head. The 3 heads were identical, each with a broad, solemn face, a thick beard the color of iron filings, and eyes of a deep, mournful gray. They did not snarl or roar. They simply regarded Hercules and his gathered cattle with a profound, weary sadness. Geryon held a great bow in one of his 6 hands, but it was not raised. He stood as a guardian, a sad sovereign of this lonely red land and its strange, beautiful herd. His size was not merely large, it was scaled to the island itself, to the immense sky and the endless ocean. He was not a beast to be fought, but a fact to be confronted, a living part of the edge of the world. The wind stirred his 3 beards. The 6 gray eyes watched, holding the weight of eternal watchfulness. The peaceful gathering of the cattle was over. The labor had reached its silent, 3-bodied guardian. The arrow flew across the red earth with a soft, deadly whisper. It was not a shot of anger or challenge, but a single, precise punctuation to the silent standoff. From one of the three identical, mournful faces, the central one, a faint, almost grateful sigh seemed to escape. Then the great form of Ceryneian shuddered, a seismic tremor passing through the three torsos. The bow slipped from a six-fingered hand. The colossal legs buckled, and the giant fell, not with a crash that shook the island, but with a heavy, final thud like a mountain settling. The six gray eyes stared unblinking at the immense, empty sky. The guardian of the red cattle was gone, his watch ended by a point of poisoned bronze. There was no triumph in the moment. Hercules retrieved his arrow, his face impassive. The cattle, indifferent to the fall of their master, continued to graze. The labor, however, was only beginning. The true test was not the confrontation, but the continent-spanning monotony that followed. He had to drive the herd from the edge of the world back to the heart of Greece. He gathered the red cattle, their numbers now his sole responsibility. With the help of the nervous sailors, he ferried them across the narrow strait to the mainland, the animals swimming strongly beside the boats, their horns like a flotilla of dark lyres on the water. On the Iberian shore, the longest journey of his life began. It was a march measured in seasons, in countless sunrises and sunsets, in the slow wearing down of sandal, leather, and spirit. He drove the herd east, following ancient herd trails and river valleys, the landscape unspooled. With a tedious grandeur, the sun-baked plains of Iberia, where the dust raised by 1,000 hooves coated his lion's pelt in a fine red powder. The rugged passes of the Pyrenees, where he navigated narrow ledges, his voice hoarse from shouting directions to the balking, sure-footed beasts. The vast, lavender-scented scrublands of southern Gaul. The rhythm was ceaseless, mind-numbing. Dawn meant rousing the herd from its rest, the animals rising with low complaints, their breath steaming in the chill. The days were a slow, plodding tide of muscle and hide. He walked at the rear or ranged along the flanks, his club a prod, his presence a boundary. The sound was a constant symphony, the deep, rhythmic thud of hooves, the swish of tails, the occasional bawl of a straying calf, the endless, dry rustle of movement through grass and brush. The sun beat down, or the rain fell in cold, drenching sheets. His world shrank to the backs of the cattle ahead, the feel of the ground underfoot, the next source of water. River crossings were particular ordeals. At the wide, rushing Rhodanus, he spent days gathering the herd, forcing them into the cold, turbulent water. He swam among them, his strength battling the current, guiding panicked animals, his hands gripping horns, his voice a steady command lost in the roar. Exhausted beasts were swept away. He plunged after them, hauling them back to the shallows. Each crossing left him and the herd spent, standing dripping and trembling on the far bank, the distance ahead seeming even more vast. Through the alpine valleys of the Padus, the air grew colder. Here, a new peril emerged. A local giant, Cacus, drawn by the magnificent herd, attempted to steal the finest bulls by dragging them backwards into his secret cave, their tracks misleading. Hercules discovered the theft, tracked the cunning thief to his lair, and slew him in a brief, furious struggle within the smoky darkness. It was a violent interlude in the months of monotony. Reminder that the world still held active threats, but it felt almost welcome, a defined problem with a clear, brutal solution, unlike the endless, grinding drive. The weariness was not just physical, it was a soul-deep fatigue of purpose. The cattle were not enemies, not treasures, not sacred charges. They were a task, a number, a weight of living flesh that had to be moved from one point on the map to another. He ate when he could, slept in fitful bursts on the hard ground, the lowing and shifting of the herd his lullaby and alarm. The stars wheeled overhead, familiar constellations his only constant companions. He spoke to no one. The lion's pelt grew thin and ragged, its gold dimmed by grime. His own beard grew wild, his hair matted. He became a figure of the landscape, as much a part of the drive as the cattle themselves. He crossed into Illyria, then turned south into Macedonia, the herd thinning slightly from hardship and predation, though its core remained, the red hides now, faded and scarred by the journey. Finally, the familiar shapes of the Greek mountains rose on the horizon. The end was in sight, but the last miles were the hardest. Every step weighted with the accumulated fatigue of a year on the move. He delivered them at dusk, driving the diminished but still impressive herd through the gates of Turins and into the royal pens. The animals, sensing an end to their endless walking, settled with weary relief. Eurystheus, peering from his bronze jar, saw only the completion of another task, the addition of strange, red cattle to his wealth. Hercules stood for a moment, watching the herd in the torchlight. The labor was done. The longest journey, a trek across the spine of the world, was over. There was no fanfare, no release. There was only a profound, hollow emptiness where the relentless rhythm of the drive had been. His muscles remembered the miles. His ears still rang with the thunder of hooves. He turned away from the pens, from the cattle, and walked into the night. A man who had carried a piece of the world's edge back to its center, bearing nothing but the dust of continents, and a weariness so deep it felt like a new kind of burden. The dust of continents, the grit of a world traversed, still seemed to coat Hercules' skin as he turned his face north, towards a destination that existed not on maps, but in the whispers of poets and the dreams of philosophers. The final object of his penance lay in a garden that was less a place than a state of being. The golden apples of the Hesperides, fruit of immortality, guarded by a dragon and nurtured by nymphs at the edge of the world. But his path, he knew, did not lead to the garden first. It led to the being who could walk there unhindered, the only one who could retrieve the apples without contest, the Titan Atlas, who bore the weight of the celestial sphere upon his shoulders. Hercules sought the bearer of the sky. The journey north from the Peloponnese was a gradual shedding of the tangible world. The solid, sun-baked hills of Greece softened, their colors bleeding into pastels. The air grew thinner, clearer, losing the sense of pine and time, acquiring instead a crystalline quality that made distant objects seem unnervingly close. He passed through valleys where streams ran not with water, but with a shimmering, liquid light that pooled in hollows without wetting the earth. The very sunlight seemed to behave differently here, not falling in rays but hanging in the air like golden gauze, catching on nothing, illuminating everything with a diffuse, ethereal glow. Trees became slender suggestions of silver, their leaves tinkling like glass when the strange breeze stirred them. The ground underfoot was no longer soil, but a resilient, moss-like substance that gave off a soft, pearlescent light with each footfall. He was walking out of geography and into myth. The silence was absolute, a profound stillness that held no threat, only a vast waiting. Emptiness. Time lost its meaning. There was no sun's arc, only the constant, gentle luminescence. He climbed a slope that was more a notion of ascent than a physical incline, and at its crest, the world ended. Before him stretched a plain of seamless, opalescent vapor like frozen cloud, and in its center a figure. Atlas was not a giant in the sense of a tall man. He was a monument. He knelt on one knee upon the vapor, his other leg braced forward, his torso bent under an unimaginable burden. Upon his shoulders and bowed back rested the celestial sphere. It was not the starry dome of night, but a perfect, translucent orb of crystalline blue, within which the faint, slow swirl of galaxies and the distant, cold glitter of nebulae could be perceived. It was the sky itself, distilled into a tangible, crushing weight. The Titan's muscles were not defined like a mortal's. They were geological formations, ranges of stone and sinew locked in eternal, straining opposition. His skin had the texture of ancient marble, veined with cracks of fatigue. His head was bowed, his face hidden by a fall of hair like carved granite, but the strain radiated from him in waves, a silent vibration in the luminous air. Hercules approached, his footsteps making no sound. He stopped a respectful distance away. For a long time, neither moved. The only sound was a faint, cosmic hum emanating from the sphere, a note so deep it was felt in the bones rather than heard. Slowly, with a grinding sound like continents shifting, Atlas turned his head. His face, when revealed, was not one of rage or pain, but of a profound, timeless melancholy. His eyes were like chips of a gray, weathered sky, holding eons of solitude. They regarded Hercules without surprise. "Son of Zeus," the Titan's voice rumbled, not from a throat, but from the very earth beneath the vapor. It was the sound of bedrock speaking. "You have come far to see an old burden born." Hercules found his own voice, small in the immense. "Quiet, I seek the apples from the garden of your daughters." A sigh like a wind leaving a cavern. "The Hesperides, a sweeter watch than mine." The Titan's gaze seemed to look through Hercules into the memory of a world before gods. "I can walk there. I remember the scent of those trees, but the sky does not allow for journeys." Hercules looked from the Titan's strained form to the beautiful, terrible sphere. He understood the unspoken proposal. It was a trade not of words, but of burdens. "If you would retrieve them," he said, his voice steady, "I will hold the sky." Atlas was silent for an age. The galaxies within the sphere turned a fraction of an inch. "You are strong," the Titan said finally, "stronger than any of your kind. But this weight is not of monsters or rivers. It is the weight of Is. It is the pressure of existence. It will find every weakness, every doubt, every hidden fracture in your spirit and press upon it until you are nothing but a scream given form." "I am familiar with weight," Hercules replied, thinking of the lion's pelt, the Hydra's smoke, the red dust of the long drive, the shame of Themyscira. Another continental sigh. "Then come, take your place." Hercules moved forward. He stood before the kneeling Titan, looking up at the curve of the sphere. He set his club down upon the luminous ground. He planted his feet wide, sinking into a stance that had borne the bull of Crete and the boar of Erymanthus. He raised his arms, his shoulders rolling, muscles coiling. Atlas, with a groan that shook the fabric of the twilight plain, began to shift. The sphere tilted, infinitesimally. Hercules slid his own shoulders under the descending edge. The transfer was not a moment, but an eternity condensed into a single, exquisite point of agony. The weight did not settle, it invaded. It was cold, a cold beyond winter, the cold of the void between stars. It pressed down not just on his body, but on his mind, his memory, his very soul. He felt the crushing loneliness of Atlas's eons flood into him. He felt the immense, silent indifference of the cosmos. His bones shrieked. His vision swam with not stars, but splinters of fractured light. The muscles of his back and legs locked, becoming pillars of pure, protesting stone. He heard nothing but the deafening hum of cosmic pressure, a sound that filled his skull until thought was impossible. He was a point of acute, conscious suffering under the infinite. The labors of the past, the strangled lion, the scorched Hydra, the driven cattle shrank to nothing, to childish trials. This was the true burden, the unbearable necessary fact of the sky. His knees trembled. His breath came in ragged, insufficient gasps. The world narrowed to the agony in his vertebrae, the scream trapped in his chest, and the perfect, terrible blue curve of the universe resting upon him. Atlas slid free, and Hercules, son of Zeus, stood in his place, a mortal man holding aloof the celestial sphere, every fiber of his being singing one pure, painful note of absolute strain. Time ceased. There was only the weight, a cold, perfect constant that dissolved the boundaries between flesh and stone, between breath and silence. Hercules stood as a new pillar in that luminous, empty plain, his world reduced to the agonizing arch of his back, and the slow, crystalline swirl of galaxies within the sphere upon his shoulders. The cosmic hum vibrated in his teeth, in the marrow of his bones, a single, sustained note of existential pressure. He could not turn his head. He could only stare straight ahead, his vision blurring at the edges, fixed on the opalescent vapor where Atlas had knelt. The Titan was gone, walking with strides that covered realms. Freed for a journey to a garden his weary mind had clung to through millennia of bearing the sky. Hercules endured. His consciousness retreated to a small, fierce point within the agony. He did not think of the apples, of Eurystheus, of penance. He thought only of maintaining the angle of his spine, of distributing the impossible load through the architecture of his legs. Sweat beaded on his forehead but did not fall. The pressure was too great. His lungs fought for each shallow sip of the thin, luminous air. The sphere was not inert. It pulsed with a slow, celestial rhythm, a heartbeat of creation that sent fresh waves of crushing force through his frame with each beat. He understood now, in his very cells, the truth of Atlas's warning. This weight was not of the earth. It was the weight of Is. It pressed not just upon his body, but upon his identity, threatening to flatten him into a mere function, a living plinth. He anchored himself in the memory of sensation, the feel of the Nemean Lion's pelt against his neck, the chill of the Stymphalian marsh spray, the gritty taste of the road. fragments of a mortal life he used as wedges against the cosmic indifference seeking to erase him. An eon or an hour later, both were the same. Change registered at the far edge of his fixed vision. A bloom of color, soft and diffuse, began to stain the opalescent plain. It was a pastel radiance, a mingling of peach and lavender and the palest green, carrying on a sudden, gentle breeze the scent of ripening fruit, of night-blooming jasmine, of dew on petals. The garden of the Hesperides. The sweetness of the air was a physical shock, a sensory memory of a world of growth and decay, so alien to this sterile, weight-burdened plain that it felt like a knife twist of longing. Then he saw Atlas. The Titan was returning, a monumental silhouette against the soft glow. In one of his vast hands he held 3 apples. They glowed with their own inner light, a warm, honeyed gold that seemed to draw the garden's pastel hues around them. They were perfect spheres of condensed sunlight, and their divine weight was palpable even across the distance. Atlas's stride was different now. There was a lightness to it, a remembered freedom. He stopped before Hercules, his granite face unreadable. The apples shimmered in his grasp. "I have them," Atlas rumbled, his voice still the sound of bedrock, but with a new, subtle resonance. He looked at the apples, then at the sky-burdened hero. "The garden is as I remembered. The air is sweet. The dragon sleeps. My daughters sing." He paused, and in that pause Hercules felt a new tension enter the luminous air, sharper than the cosmic pressure. The Titan was tasting liberty. The thought of resuming his eternal burden, now that he had moved, now that he had held the apples and walked in the garden, was a fresh and terrible prospect. "It is a heavy thing you hold, son of Zeus," Atlas said, his gray eyes calculating. "Perhaps I should deliver these to your king myself. You seem comfortable." The trickery in that moment was born of stark necessity, not malice. Hercules, his mind screaming within its prison of strain, understood the trap. If Atlas left with the apples, he would never return. The hero would be pinned for eternity, a replacement Titan. Through gritted teeth, forcing air into his compressed chest, he spoke. His voice was a strained rasp, barely audible over the celestial hum. "As you wish. Your strength is unmatched." He paused, swallowing against the pressure. "But this burden shifts, it grinds. Before you go, grant me a moment's relief. Place the apples on the ground and take the sky onto your shoulders once more, properly positioned. Only for a moment. So I may adjust my cloak to pad my neck. The pain is considerable." He saw the calculation in the Titan's eyes. A momentary resumption, a simple realignment. It seemed a small price for permanent freedom. A nod, slow as a mountain's ascent. A moment only. Atlas carefully set the 3 golden apples upon the luminous ground, where they glowed like fallen suns. Then he turned his vast back to Hercules and braced himself. "Prepare." With a groan that shook the fabric of the twilight. Plain, Hercules shifted, tilting the sphere. The transfer of agony was reversed. The unbearable weight lifted from his shoulders, and he felt a surge of lightness so violent it was nauseating. His muscles, released from their locked torment, trembled uncontrollably. Atlas settled the sky back onto his own stony shoulders with a deep, resonant sigh that held both resignation and a lingering memory of free movement. Hercules did not hesitate. He staggered forward one step, too, his body screaming in protest at the sudden, shocking absence of pressure. He bent, the motion agony, and scooped the 3 apples from the ground. They were warm, almost living in his hand, and their weight was profound, not physical but metaphysical, the heaviness of eternity contained in perfect, golden skin. He clutched them to his chest, against the lion's pelt. Atlas turned his head, the gray eyes widening with dawning understanding, then narrowing with a timeless, weary anger. Deception. Necessity. Hercules rasped, already backing away, his legs weak, his entire being a chorus of pain. The labor is mine to complete. The burden is yours to bear. My thanks for the apples and for the lesson in wait. He turned, forcing his trembling legs into a stumbling walk, then a ragged run across the opalescent plain, away from the Titan and the crushing sphere. He did not look back. The sweet, garden-scented breeze faded, replaced once more by the thin, silent air of the mythical pass. The apples in his arms pulsed with their golden light. He held them, not with the triumph of a thief, but with the profound, hollow understanding of a man who had traded one unbearable weight for another. He had tricked a primordial being, not for glory, but for survival. The apples were divine, the prize of the Hesperides, but they felt like a theft, a transaction of cosmic deceit. Their intangible weight, the memory of Atlas's betrayed, weary gaze, and the ghost of the celestial sphere still pressing on. His soul settled upon him as he fled the edge of the world, a new and subtle burden among all the rest. The final labor began not with a roar, but with an entrance. The cave at Taenarum was a gash in the sun-bleached flesh of the southern Peloponnese, a dark, yawning mouth, exhaling a breath of air several degrees cooler than the surrounding afternoon heat. Hercules stood before it, the golden apples of the Hesperides a memory of stolen light in his possession, their metaphysical weight now joined by the knowledge of the last, impossible task, to descend into the realm of the dead and bring back its guardian, the hound Cerberus, alive. No monster of flesh, no distant treasure, but the very symbol of death's finality. The labor was a violation of the natural order, and the landscape seemed to know it. He entered the cave. The transition was immediate and absolute. The bright, noisy world of life, the cicadas' drone, the scent of dry thyme and hot stone, the vivid blues and golds of the sky was sliced away as if by a door closing. Inside, the light from the entrance died within 10 paces, swallowed by a darkness that was not mere absence, but a substance. The air grew still and cold, carrying a mineral dampness and a faint, ancient odor of wet clay and deep roots. The sound of his own breath and the scuff of his sandals on the stone floor became magnified, echoing faintly into a void that seemed to listen. The descent was not a single path, but a winding, treacherous negotiation of the earth's guts. The tunnel sloped downward, sometimes in gentle declines, sometimes in sheer, rocky drops where he had to feel for handholds in the pitch black. The lion's pelt, which had turned blades and claws, was useless against the creeping chill. The darkness was so complete it felt like pressure on the eyes. He moved by touch and by an instinct for downward, his club tapping ahead like a blind man's cane. The tonal shift from the world above was profound. It was a journey out of color into monochrome. Even in the black, His mind's eye began to paint the world in shades of gray, ash, and bone. After an immeasurable time, a faint, sourceless luminescence began to seep into the darkness. It was not light, but the ghost of light, a grayish phosphorescence that clung to the walls and ceiling, revealing the tunnel's anatomy. The rock here was smooth, worn by no water but by the passage of countless shades. The air grew colder still, a dry cold that settled in the lungs. The faint sound of dripping water echoed from unseen places, each drop a measure of eternity. The craggy, natural tunnel began to open into wider, more formed spaces, vast, subterranean gorges with ceilings lost in gloom. A river of black water, silent and slow as poured oil, appeared to his left, flowing with a purpose he could not discern. This was the beginning of Hades's domain. Life in any form he recognized had receded completely. No moss clung to the stones. No insects skittered in the faint light. The only vegetation was occasional patches of a brittle gray fungus that crumbled to dust at a touch. The silence was no longer empty, but thick, a listening silence that felt occupied. He became aware he was not alone. At first, they were just movements at the edge of the gray luminescence, faint shimmers like heat haze. Then they resolved into forms, human shapes but without substance, woven from the same ashen light that illuminated the caverns. The shades of the dead. They did not approach him. They parted before his solid, living presence as a mist parts before a stone, flowing around him at a distance. Their faces were blurred, their features indistinct, but he felt their attention. A collective, wordless curiosity mixed with a deep, weary sadness. They made no sound. They simply were an endless, silent procession flowing in the opposite direction of his descent, towards some deeper, final gathering place. Their presence was not threatening, but it underscored the profound wrongness of his own. He was an intrusion, a splash of color and warmth and pounding blood in a realm of chill, monochrome eternity. The gorges gave way to a vast, flat plain of black sand and smooth, dark rock. In the distance, the outlines of a structure were just visible, a palace of somber, cyclopean stone, its lines severe and without ornament. This was the house of Hades itself. A palpable aura of power and finality emanated from it, a static charge in the still air. The river he had followed, which he now knew as the Styx, curled around its foundations like a moat of oblivion. Hercules approached. The great doors of blackened bronze, twice his height, stood slightly ajar. No guard stood watch. What need had death for centuries? He pushed one door open, the metal moving without a sound on hinges of shadow. The hall within was vast, lit by the same sourceless gray light. It was empty of furniture, of tapestries, of life. At its far end, on a simple throne of basalt, sat the god of the underworld. Hades was not a skeleton or a wraith, but a figure of pale, majestic austerity. He was tall and powerfully built, his skin the color of marble left in moonlight, his hair and beard a dark, flowing shadow. He wore a simple chiton of charcoal gray. His eyes were the most striking feature, deep, obsidian pools that held not malice, but an infinite, weary understanding of endings. He radiated a cold authority that was not cruel, but absolute. Beside him stood his queen, Persephone, a figure of contrasting, sorrowful beauty, her own eyes holding the memory of spring flowers in a field of ash. Hercules stopped at a respectful distance and bowed his head, a gesture not of submission, but of acknowledgement to the sovereign of this realm. He stated his business, his voice strangely loud in the silent hall, echoing the decree of Eurystheus and the will of the gods above. Hades listened, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant, imagined echo of the river Styx. Finally, the god spoke. His voice was low, resonant, and dry as stone dust. You ask to take my guardian. Cerberus is the seal on the gate. He is the finality that gives peace meaning. I ask only to fulfill the last labor imposed upon me, Hercules replied, his own voice steady. I seek not to break your seal, but to borrow its symbol and return it. Hades studied him, those dark eyes seeing not just the hero, but the trail of labors behind him, the blood, the fire, the patience, the regret. He saw the weight already carried. You have walked in sun and sea, in marsh and mountain, the god said. You have borne the sky itself. You understand the nature of burdens. A pause, heavy as the stone of the throne. You may try. You may take him if you can master him without weapon, without poison, by your hands and your will alone. And you will return him unharmed. This is my condition. Break it and you will remain here not as a shade but as a prisoner of your own failure, a curiosity for eternity. It was wary permission, a test wrapped in a concession. Hercules nodded. I agree. Hades said nothing more. He merely gestured with one pale hand, a slight motion towards a smaller, darker archway to the left of the throne. The audience was over. Persephone offered a faint, almost imperceptible nod, her eyes holding a glimmer of something, pity perhaps, or a spark of fascination for the living fool who would challenge the ultimate guardian. Hercules turned and walked towards the archway, leaving the silent, majestic figures on their thrones. The gray light of the hall did not penetrate the arch. Beyond lay a deeper darkness from which a new kind of silence seemed to breathe. A silence not of emptiness, but of latent, monstrous presence. The wary permission was his. The final test awaited in the gloom. Beyond the archway, the gray luminescence of Hades's hall faded into a deeper, more profound gloom. The air grew colder, still acquiring a sharp, metallic tang that coated the back of the throat. This was no cavern or constructed hall, but a vast, undefined space at the very root of the underworld, a place of formless shadow and absolute quiet. The ground underfoot was smooth, featureless stone, cold as a tomb slab. Hercules moved forward slowly, his senses straining against the oppressive darkness. The only sound was the soft scuff of his sandals and the low rush of his own breath, which plumed faintly in the chill, visible only as a momentary, ghostly exhalation before being swallowed by the dark. He felt the presence before he saw it, a pressure in the silence, a density in the air that had nothing to do with cold or stone. It was the weight of watchfulness, of a consciousness vast, ancient, and singularly focused. He stopped, his grip tightening on the club he knew he could not use. Hades's condition echoed in his mind, by your hands and your will alone. Then from the darkness ahead, 2 points of light ignited. They were not the dull gray of the underworld luminescence, nor the fiery amber of a beast's eyes. They were a smoky, deep red like banked coals seen through a thick veil of ash. They hovered unmoving at a height just above his own head. A moment later, two more pairs of these same dim, smoldering lights winked into existence slightly lower and to either side. 6 points of faint crimson glow, arranged in a rough triangle, all fixed upon him. Cerberus emerged from the shadow not with a lunge or a growl, but with a slow, silent solidification, as if the darkness itself were coalescing into form. The Hound of Hades was not a creature of flesh as the world above understood it. He was a creature of essence, of solidified gloom and silent power. His shape was that of a monstrous dog, but his substance was like black smoke given muscle and mass, absorbing the faint light rather than reflecting it. His 3 heads were not separate entities, but flowed from a single, powerful neck, each bearing the same formidable mastiff-like structure, with jaws that could encompass a man's torso. The 6 red eyes glowed from within that living shadow. His paws, the size of shields, were planted wide on the stone, utterly soundless. A mane of darker, writhing shadow bristled around his 3 necks. He made no sound. No growl, no pant, no scrape of claw. This was the ultimate guardian, and his power was not rage, but an implacable, patient certainty. He was the final door, and his mere presence was the lock. Hercules set his club down on the stone with a soft, definitive click. The sound was absurdly small in the immense quiet. He stood empty-handed before the creature, feeling the immense, silent power radiating from it like cold from a glacier. This was not a battle to be won with force, but with controlled strength. A test of pure will against an embodiment of finality. He took a step forward. The 6 red eyes tracked him. Cerberus did not move. Hercules took another step and another, closing the distance with deliberate slowness. The air grew colder near the Hound, a chill that seeped into the bones. When he was within 10 paces, the center head lowered slightly, the jaws parting soundlessly to reveal teeth that were not white, but the dull gray of old, weathered bone. A breath, colder than the air around it, washed over Hercules, carrying a scent like dry stone and forgotten graves. Hercules moved. It was not a charge, but a swift, direct advance. The moment he entered the sphere of the creature's reach, Cerberus reacted. It was not a pounce, but an expansion. The shadowy form seemed to swell, the 3 heads striking from different angles with a speed that belied their size, a coordinated, silent assault. Hercules ducked under the lunge of the left head, his shoulder brushing against the chilling, smoke-like pelt. He twisted, avoiding the snapping jaws of the right, and threw his arms around the neck of the central head as it darted in. Contact was a shock. The Hound's body was not solid in the way of a living animal. It was dense, viscous shadow, cold enough to burn. Hercules locked his arms, his muscles bunching against a resistance that felt less like flesh and more like trying to contain a rushing, dark current. Cerberus did not roar. He thrashed with a terrifying, silent strength. The other 2 heads whipped around, jaws snapping at Hercules' back and sides. He clung on, his face pressed into the chilling, scentless mane, his world reduced to the strain in his arms and back, the freezing burn of the contact, and the absolute, breathless silence of the struggle. There was no sound of combat, no snarls, no grunts of effort, only the faint scuff of Hercules' sandals on the stone as he was driven backward by the Hound's raw power, and the violent, silent whipping of 3 shadowy heads. It was a contest of containment. Hercules' strength, forged in a dozen brutal labors, met a force that was the very concept of denial. He tightened his hold, his breath coming in ragged, steaming gasps. He could feel the unnatural life within the form, a pulse like a slow, deep drumbeat of oblivion. The other heads struck at him, their bone-gray teeth grazing the lion's pelt, finding no purchase on the invulnerable hide but transferring waves of paralyzing cold through the impact. His own skin began to numb where it touched the creature. His fingers, locked together, grew stiff. He shifted his weight, using his legs as anchors, and began to exert pressure not to strangle but to control. He forced the central head downward, towards the stone floor. The shadowy body resisted, a mountain of dark will. Hercules' vision spotted with the effort, his tendons standing out like cables. He was not fighting a beast, he was wrestling a principle. Gradually, inch by agonizing inch, the central head was pressed down. One of the other heads dove in, jaws gaping for his arm. He released one hand from his lock and caught the shadowy muzzle, his fingers sinking into the cold, dense mist of its substance. He held it, his arm trembling with the strain of restraining two of the three heads simultaneously. The final, breathless test was one of pure endurance. Hercules stood braced, his body a living cage of muscle and will, holding the swirling, silent violence of the guardian at bay. The cold was leaching his strength, seeping into his core. The silence of the struggle was maddening, amplifying every gasp, every creak of his own joints. He focused on the heat of his own blood, the memory of the sun on his face, the weight of the lion's pelt, anchors in the mortal world he was defending himself from losing. With a final, grinding effort, he forced the central head fully to the ground, pinning it under his knee. The other two heads stilled, their red eyes glowing down at him. The great, shadowy body ceased its thrashing. Cerberus lay subdued, not unconscious, not defeated, but mastered. The silent power was contained, held in check by a strength, and will that had, for this moment, matched it. The only movement was the slow, rhythmic pulse within the shadow form, and the steam of Hercules' exhausted breath coiling in the frigid air. He did not release his hold. Keeping one hand firmly on the muzzle of the left head and his knee on the central one, he reached with his free hand to his belt. From it, he took a chain he had brought from the world above, links of solid bronze, strong enough to anchor a ship. With careful, deliberate movements, he looped it around the three necks, just behind the jaws, and fastened it with a heavy, locking clasp. The chain looked stark and solid against the hound's shadowy pelt, a tangible bond from the world of substance. Only then did he release his grip and rise, his body aching with cold and fatigue. He took the end of the chain. Cerberus rose with him, a dark mountain of subdued power. The 6 red eyes regarded him, no longer fixed with predatory intent, but with a passive, watchful acceptance. The guardian was leashed. Hercules turned, the chain firm in his hand, and began the long walk back towards the archway, the lightless hall, and the distant throne. Cerberus followed at his side, a creature of absolute shadow moving with silent, obedient steps. The contrast was profound. The hero, clad in the golden pelt of a vanquished beast, his form radiating the spent heat of life and effort, leading the embodiment of death's finality on a chain of bronze. They moved through the gloom, a dark procession of two, beginning the ascent from the realm of ash and silence back towards the world of light, color, and sound. The last and greatest burden of the labors walking silently beside him. The ascent from the realm of shadows was a slow rebirth into sensation. The oppressive silence of the underworld gave way to the distant, tentative sounds of dripping water, then to the whisper of his own breath echoing in the winding tunnel. The chill that had seeped into his bones began to retreat, replaced by a growing warmth carried on a faint, upward draft. The gray luminescence faded behind him, and true darkness returned. But now it was the familiar, navigable dark of the cave at Ceryneian. He climbed, the bronze chain firm in his hand, the silent, shadowy mass of Cerberus moving with him, a vast, cool presence at his side. The hound's 6 red eyes were dimmed, mere embers in the black, offering no resistance, only the profound, watchful patience of its nature. When they finally emerged into the late afternoon sun, the world assaulted Hercules with a violence of life. Light, after the monochrome gloom, was a physical blow, dazzling and golden. Heat washed over his chilled skin. The air was thick with the scent of pine, dry earth, and wild thyme, a perfume so rich it felt dizzying. Bird song, raucous and careless, shattered the remembered silence. He stood blinking at the cave's mouth, his body trembling not from effort but from the shock of re-entry. Cerberus beside him seemed to solidify further in the light, the shadow stuff of its form drinking the sun, becoming a creature of deepest, impenetrable black against the vibrant greens and browns of the hillside. It did not flinch or growl. It simply was, an alien truth brought into the day. The journey to Ceryneian was a silent, spectral procession. Word flew ahead of him, carried by shepherds who fled at the sight. By the time he reached the citadel, the streets were empty, doors bolted, shutters closed. A terrified silence had replaced the usual clamor of the lower town. He walked unchallenged through the gates, up the winding path to the palace, the chain links clinking softly with each step, the only sound in the hushed air. He found Eurystheus in the inner courtyard, but the king was not on his throne. True to his nature, he had taken refuge inside his great bronze storage jar, its lid askew. Only his pale, sweat-sheened face and wide, rolling eyes were visible over the rim. The sight of Cerberus, the 3 heads, the smoke-like pelt, the 6 dimly glowing eyes drove the king into a paroxysm of pure, gibbering terror. A high, thin wail escaped his lips. He tried to shrink further into the jar, his fingers scrabbling at the bronze. Hercules stopped a respectful distance away. He did not speak. He simply stood, holding the chain, allowing the presence of the final labor to fill the sunlit courtyard. The message was unmistakable, wordless, and complete. The 12th task was done. The cycle of impossible demands had reached its absolute end. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement from the cowering king. Hercules turned and left, the silent hound at his side. The audience was over. His obligation to Eurystheus was extinguished, as suddenly and finally as a snuffed candle. But one obligation remained, the condition set in the silent hall of basalt. He returned the way he had come, retracing his steps south towards Ceryneian. The journey was a quiet mirror of the first, but the weight was different. He was not descending into dread, but delivering a kept promise. At the cave mouth, as twilight began to stain the sky with purple, he unfastened the bronze chain from around the three shadowy necks. He placed a hand briefly on the great, cool head of the central guardian. No words passed between them. Cerberus turned, a movement of flowing darkness, and without a backward glance, melted into the deepening gloom of the cave's throat, returning to his eternal watch. The chain, now just a length of metal, Hercules left coiled on a rock, a votive offering, or perhaps a symbol discarded. He was free. He did not return to Turin's. He walked instead to a high, lonely cliff that overlooked the Saronic Gulf. The last light of day bled across the water, turning the sea into a sheet of hammered copper. Behind him, the lands of the Peloponnese faded into blue and indigo shadows. He stood there, the lion's pelt hanging heavy on his shoulders, and looked out over the seas and lands he had traversed. The labors were done. The physical burdens, the lion, the boar, the cattle, the sky itself, had been lifted, but their weight remained. It had migrated inward. He felt the memories not as stories, but as landscapes etched upon his soul. The sun-dappled silence of Nemea, the choking, acrid smoke of Lerna, the crystalline hush of Erymanthius's snow, the cathartic roar of the rivers in Elys, the metallic clatter of Stymphalus giving way to sweet quiet, the vast, lonely sky over the ocean, the grim, windswept plains of Thrace, the tragic sweetness of Themyscira's air before the poison entered it, the red dust of a world's edge, the exquisite cosmic agony of the sphere, the silent, chilling struggle in the dark. They were all within him now, a personal geography of endurance. The monsters were gone, but their echoes lingered. The souls he had encountered, the fallen Hippolyta, the mournful Geryon, the betrayed Atlas, the silent shades, they resided in him too, a gallery of regrets and respects. He had sought atonement and he had received it in full measure, but it was not the clean slate he might have imagined. It was a tapestry, heavy and intricate, woven from every struggle, every landscape, every drop of sweat and blood. He was not cleansed, he was asterisk-filled. The last sliver of sun vanished beneath the horizon. Stars, sharp and cold, began to prick through the velvet blue. A soft breeze came off the sea, carrying the night's chill. It was the same breeze that had carried the narrator's voice at the beginning of the long journey. And so the journey ends where all journeys must. The voice seemed to whisper on the wind, no longer leading but reflecting, not with the lifting of a burden but with its integration. The hero stands alone, as all beings ultimately do, carrying not a club or a pelt but the sum of his passages. The mountains climbed, the rivers crossed, the darkness faced, they are not behind him. They are the ground upon which he now stands. Look, the labors are done, but the man remains, a silhouette against the dawn of his own hard-won stillness. His story is now part of the quiet night. Hercules stood on the cliff, a solid shape against the deepening twilight. The winds of the world he had circled stirred the ragged edges of the lion's mane. He did not move. He simply breathed in and out, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon where sea met sky. The weight was his. The memories were his. The long journey was over. The rest, whatever it might be, was his to carry forward into whatever dawn would come.